like to introduce Nelson Cunningham, who's founder, partner of McClarty Associates, a lawyer by training, but has worked with Biden and worked with a number of administrations, and knows a lot about the U.S., and we're very glad to have him come to tell us what he thinks about the effects of the recent midterm elections. We all know what happened, but what does it mean?
Great. Well, again, thanks for allowing me to pick your brains while we were eating earlier. It incredibly useful for us and for me. As I mentioned at the start, this is my third time being with an ACCJ group over lunch. It's always an incredibly engaged audience, and we've already shown that in the dialogue we've had, answering some of the questions I've had. I'm here in Tokyo this week, in part because of our business. We're here. We help companies around the world. We help companies that do business in Japan. We help Japanese companies that do business around the world. We handle the public policy issues. We handle regulatory challenges. We help them deal with governments in places like India, Brazil, China, Indonesia, Mexico. And the lucky thing for me is that I get to work with people like Crystal Floor and Tom Hubbard. So I'm this smart on every part of the world. They are this smart on every part of the world, and I get to benefit from that. One of the areas where I have spent a bit more time with some of my colleagues is on the U.S. political process, having worked in the Clinton White House, having worked for Senator Biden when he was chairman of the Judiciary Committee, having worked for John Kerry, both in his first Senate race in 1984, and then I spent way too much time in 2004 on his presidential race, more than my partners ever knew. And was just pleased to be asked to join his Foreign Affairs Policy Board. And we just met 3 weeks ago with him. So the intersection between politics and foreign policy is one where I spend most of my day and most of my evening trolling the internet. So I look forward to walking you through my quick observations on what's happened this week, and then taking your questions. Let me divide my talk into four sections. First of all, the midterms themselves, what it meant this week, what conclusions do we draw? Second, what might happen in the lame duck session of Congress that will convene next week and continue for who knows how long? Third, from the economic agenda standpoint, what do we see in the next 2 years of the next session of Congress? New Republican leadership, different configuration in the House, very different one in the Senate. And then fourth, what impact on the 2016 elections, both for Congress and for the presidential races. So let me start with this week. I spoke to the U.S. Korea Business Council on Wednesday, just as the polls were closing. So we had only limited information. I had to keep on pausing my remarks and refreshing the browser on my phone to see what else had happened. At that time, I said, look, it's going to be a good night for Republicans, clearly, going into it. The question is, will it be a great night? Well, it turned out not just to be a great night, but a blowout night. Mark Warner is someone I've known for many years. I respect him. He's relentlessly crafted a centrist stand, and one that is very close to the voters of Virginia. He has won overwhelmingly 2 elections in a row as governor and as senator. And he is hanging on with against an opponent, Ed Gillespie, who didn't even have money to go up on the air until October. And Warner is about 3/4 percentage point ahead. So even he went from a comfortable double-digit lead to being almost blown out, and he may yet be as the votes are counted. The change was everywhere across the country. The only embattled Democrat, really, who won at the national level was Jeanne Shaheen in New Hampshire. And that was partly because Scott Brown was really from Massachusetts and not from New Hampshire. If it hadn't been for that, he probably would have won. At the state races, we also saw governors who 2 weeks ago thought they were in deep trouble. Republican governors won handily. And there were 2 states, deep blue states, deep blue states, that elected Republican governors, Maryland and Massachusetts, and big surprises in both cases. So what happened? And I think clearly President Obama was at the center of the agenda for voters, either opposition to him or feeding an apathy that caused Democrats not to turn out. I think as we look back at this election, one of the things that we'll remember about this election was in most places the incredibly low turnout. In 2010, the last midterms, Democrats were a little disillusioned, but boy, Republicans and the Tea Party folks were really enthused. And they turned out in substantial numbers for a midterm year. This year, they're still compiling the numbers, but it's off dramatically from most midterm years, and certainly from 2012. 58% of the population voted in 2012, the last presidential year. Something like 36% of the population voted on Tuesday. A 22% difference. So what that tells you, it's an entirely different electorate that went to the polls on Tuesday than went to the polls in 2012, and that you might expect to go to the polls in 2016. Much whiter, older, much more conservative. You saw many fewer of what have become sort of the stalwarts for the Democratic Party in presidential years. Single women, Hispanics, other people of color, college students simply didn't vote. So the Democrats can assuage themselves a bit, or assuage their dismay a bit by saying, well, this was temporary. It was because we just couldn't get our guys out, but don't worry, in 2016 we'll be back. And yet, of course, the changes and the change in governance over the next 2 years is dramatic and will institutionalize a change that may last for, that may last for many years. Those are the elections themselves. The lame duck session. Lame duck sessions are one of the weirdest creatures in any political system. Many of these people have lost their jobs. They're immediately thinking about their own political futures. The Republicans in the Senate will all be measuring the drapes on the bigger offices they'll be getting, on the committees that they hope to join. There are some essential bills that need to get through in the next several weeks, and there'll be a race between how quickly they get those through and how quickly people run home. What needs to be done in the next few weeks? First of all, there has to be a continuing resolution to fund the government into next year. McConnell and Boehner said we're not going to have a fiscal cliff issue on this. We're not going to shut down the government over this. Second, there's a tax extenders bill, a sort of a miscellaneous tax package that if it's not extended is going to wreak havoc on tax filings next April. That probably gets done. The president has said he wants to talk to Congress about additional force authorization to combat ISIS. Right now he's relying on the post 9/11 congressional resolutions. I think everyone understands that needs to be broadened. The U.S. and Iran might be nearing a deal on the nuclear discussions. November 24th is the nominal date. Of course, that can slip, but the signals one gets from both sides, and I saw President Rouhani when he was in New York in September at the UN meeting. Both sides have a forward lean on this, and I think would like to make forward progress. If an agreement is reached, Congress is going to want to weigh in. They might want to weigh in beforehand with conservatives in the Congress criticizing the president for negotiating with Iranians, criticizing the president for being insufficiently strong in looking after Israel's interests. Although the president, frankly, I believe that it is in Israel's long-term interest to find a peaceful solution here, and one that reaches an accommodation that can reintegrate Iran in a positive fashion. But Congress is going to want to weigh in here. And this and ISIS resolution will be the first instances in which Congress, a newly Republican Congress, they haven't taken the gavel yet, but they're feeling pretty powerful, are going to try to shape President Obama's foreign policy, which will continue over the next 2 years and which will lay a prelude to the 2016 elections. The big question I've been asked by everyone in both Korea and Japan is, what about trade promotion authority? Is there room in the lame duck session for TPA? Several months ago, that was kind of the secret plan for all of us who are pro-trade, and though I'm a Democrat, I'm strongly pro-trade, was, well, let's get it done in the lame duck. When Max Baucus went to China, Ron Wyden then came in as Democratic chair of the Finance Committee. He had his own ideas of what a Trade Promotion Authority Act should look like. So even though Baucus and Hatch had worked out something, Wyden kind of went back to the drawing board and convened hearings and wanted to have TPA for the 21st century. And now that might create something that's more politically enduring than what we've had before in terms of a trade consensus, but it can't help but slow things down when it comes to actually getting something through the Congress. So the dream of a lame duck TPA resolution, I think, has slipped somewhat, but I've been heartened by reports that the staffs of the Republican and the Democratic sides on the Finance Committee have been exchanging language. I've been heartened by President Obama's statement that he is looking forward to boosting exports and opening markets, which is sort of Democratic code words for trade. He can't quite bring himself to say the T word, but he talks about boosting exports and opening markets. And McConnell, Boehner, and Hatch have all been very explicit since the election in saying that they want Trade Promotion Authority to be at the very top of the agenda. Now, will it happen in the lame duck? It could. I mean, these things happen. I'm sure the Chamber of Commerce is right now on the telephone to the Republican leadership saying, please don't let politics or egos get in the way of getting this done. Let's try to use this opportunity. We're as far away from the next elections as we can be. A lot of people have lost their jobs. It's a free vote for them. Let's try to get it up and out. Counteracting that will be the natural Republican interest, frankly, in wanting to take credit for TPA. It's a Republican agenda item, has been for a long time. Why wouldn't Orrin Hatch want to be holding the gavel when it gets gavelled through? Why wouldn't Mitch McConnell want to be the one to negotiate the final deal and push it through Congress and sit down with the president? So that, I think, is the dynamic we're going to see. Will it happen in the lame duck session? Will it happen after the new Congress convenes in January? Either way, I think we have to get TPA up and out by the end of the first quarter of next year in order to be able to then move forward with TPP, conclude TPP, and then give Congress the time that TPA requires to review the bill, to consult, to hold their hearings. There's an entire timetable laid out in Trade Promotion Authority bills that extends it for at least several months after TPA is introduced before it can be brought up for a vote. It has to get done in 2015. If you push off a vote on TPP into an election year, you have to be concerned that it's going to get caught up in election year politics one way or the other. So we, friends of trade and TPA, are looking for something to come out either in the lame duck, or probably not, or in the first quarter of next year. Now, just because President Obama has authorized his trade representative to start the most ambitious trade talks in a generation, when you combine TPP and TTIP and the ITA agreements, the information technology agreements before the WTO, the services agreement, it's the most ambitious trade agenda we've had. This is a Democratic president who's pushed forward with this. The president himself has not put his shoulder to the wheel on trade. The Secretary of State talks about trade every opportunity he can. Secretary of Commerce certainly does. Mike Froman certainly does. Even Vice President Biden, who has not been known as a huge fan of trade, has been vocal in his support of the trade agreements because he understands it's absolutely geostrategic for the U.S. to be able to have leadership on TTIP, on TPP, on all these agenda items, because it's a once-in-a-generation chance to lock in some real trade gains and to lock in key economic alliances with some of our closest partners in the world. The president clearly believes it, but he hasn't put his shoulder to the wheel yet. Will he do it? Question mark. I certainly hope so. Second, can the Republicans, especially the conservative Republicans, find themselves voting for something that Barack Obama wants? You know, the divisions there are so deep. There is such antipathy between the conservative wing of the Republican Party and the president. By the way, I saw this, we all saw this when President Bush was in office, there were Democrats who couldn't bring themselves, or could barely bring themselves to support something that he brought before them, even if it was something they wanted. So I'm not casting blame on one side or the other here. It's a natural dynamic. Will they be able to really say yes to the president on trade, or will they insist on taking a hostage? Mr. President, you want trade? Fine. How badly do you want it? What are you willing to give us in order to support the trade agenda? We're already seeing signs of that. Yesterday, I believe it was McConnell who said, Mr. President, if you do an executive order on immigration, which unilaterally, through executive order, puts in some of the changes to our immigration process that the Congress has not been able to do. Sir, if you do that, you're going to poison the well, and that's going to put an end to trade discussions and others. Maybe immigration is the hostage that the Republicans look for. By the way, I think it's too much of a hostage. The president won't give up on immigration reform just to promote a trade agenda. I think it would be a tragedy if that became the Republican price for trade. But you can imagine others. The Exim Bank. We've all seen how the Exim Bank was held up earlier this year. Reauthorization was held up by Republicans in the House and by some Republicans in the Senate who are concerned that the Exim Bank is a distortion of the market, despite the fact that the Chamber of Commerce was out there pushing hard for Exim and pushing hard for reauthorization of Exim. The best they could do was a reauthorization of a few months, and this is going to come up again in the first months of the next Congress. Will Exim reform, the death of Exim, be the price for trade? I worry a bit that there might be a desire on the part of the Republicans to get too much for a trade vote, and that can get in the way of where we would all like to go on TPA. Let me use that to segue into what I think we can expect in the next 2 years. And I think the issue, broadly speaking, is will the Republican majority want to govern, or will they want to posture? Will they want to come to agreement with the president on issues? Are they willing to compromise? McConnell certainly says so. Boehner certainly has said so on some individual items. McConnell said, look, I'm not going to change my mind. I don't expect the president to change his mind, but there might be room to do things together. Or will the Republican position be to draw sharp lines? To say, look, for 2016, we need to draw some clear distinctions between us and the president on taxes, on fiscal issues, on defense spending, perhaps on social issues. And you can see where a Republican Congress would settle into sending up bills to the president, or trying to send up bills to the president, that they know the president will oppose and that he won't favor. Why? In order to be able to create issues on which they can run in 2016. I wouldn't fault them for that. There's going to be voices in the Republican Party who are going to say, look, you know how we got where we are today, controlling the House, controlling the Senate? It was by doubling down on our conservative mandate. It was not in compromising with the president. It was by drawing a clear distinction for the American people about where we stood and what we thought the flaws were in his program, and it worked for us. The other side will say, now wait a minute, that might work for us in off years, but it won't work for us in a presidential election year. Remember what I said before about the demographics of the electorate this time around? You know, in 2 years, you're going to be back up over 50% when it comes to the percentage of people who are voting. The electorate's going to be a very different electorate that went to the polls on Tuesday. It's going to be a much more democratic electorate. So you'll hear the voices in the Republican Party saying, we need to appeal to those people because that's our next election. So let's come to agreement rather than doubling down on a conservative agenda. To which the conservatives will say, oh yeah? Well, last time around, we nominated the most moderate candidate who was up, Mitt Romney. 4 years before that, we nominated the most moderate Republican candidate who was in the field. That was John McCain. You think moderation works? We think it doesn't. We should double down. And let us introduce you to Ted Cruz. Let us introduce you to Marco Rubio. Let us introduce you to Rick Perry, or perhaps to Rand Paul. So I think that debate is one we're going to see vigorously carried out in the opening weeks and months of the Congress in the next 2 years. Will it be govern or posture? Will it be try to come to agreement on key issues, or will it not be? What are the key issues on which they might come to agreement? Clearly, trade is one of them. We've already talked about that. Second, corporate tax reform. Both sides agree we have to do something about this. Both sides agree that having the highest or the second highest tax rate in the world for corporations is not helpful for U.S. investment. It puts CEOs in a terribly difficult position where they start looking at places like Ireland and cantons in Switzerland as places to move their headquarters. And it hurts our ability to actually collect sufficient revenue. So both sides want lower taxes. Obama wants to lower it from 35 to 28. Republicans say 38 to 25. Obama says, I don't want it to be revenue neutral because I need that extra revenue that we raise. I want to spend it on infrastructure, which is important to me. Republicans say, no, it has to be revenue neutral. We have to eliminate enough loopholes so that there's no net gain in taxes from this. And by the way, while we're at it, we need to talk about individual income tax rates. There's a lot of small businesses pay taxes as individuals and not on the corporate scale. So you can see these conversations way off kilter and not what we're thinking. You could also see room to two sides to come together. Infrastructure is another issue on which we see both sides together. You don't have to spend much time going through the airport, driving the highways, bridges, Tokyo, and Japan, to have real infrastructure is what I feel. Having flown JFK this past Monday, there's nothing about JFK that needs to be in any kind. And nothing about the highways from Manhattan to JFK that we ending. So we all know we need to spend on infrastructure, and there will be powerful consensus in favor of that. The last thing I think that's a big thing that might get done is immigration. There are voices in the Republican Party that say we need to appeal to Hispanics. We need to, for presidential election purposes and for our future, we cannot take such a growing and increasingly vigorous part of the electorate and make them feel unwelcome in our party. This is a debate. Just as trade is difficult for Democrats, immigration is enormously difficult for Republicans. And how they settle that one out, I can't tell you. I'd like to thank many of my colleagues, like John Negroponte, Rick Burt, my colleagues at McClarty Associates, who are well-known internationalist Republicans, will be very strongly in favor of immigration reform, and so will much of the leadership in Washington. But they have to contend with the wing that is strongly anti-immigration. By the way, Rick Burt, our partner who runs our Asia practice, is also... I'm sorry?
Europe practice.
Our Europe practice, not Asia practice. Is also Rand Paul's chief foreign policy advisor. So Paul gave a speech 2 weeks ago, a major foreign policy address, written by Rick Burt. So we try to be relentlessly bipartisan at our firm because we understand you have to understand both sides in order to be able to advise companies, U.S. companies and foreign companies, on what's happening in Washington. So internationalist Republicans, national Republicans favor immigration reform. Where it comes out, I don't know. The Democratic position is easy. Multicultural, we're not afraid of foreign influences. We welcome these immigrants into the political process. P.S. We welcome them into the Democratic Party once they can vote. Their position is clear. How it comes out, I don't know. Grand bargain on the budget. It'd be nice to see. Boehner and Obama actually came close on it. McConnell is a deal maker. McConnell likes to make deals. In the last 2 years of administration, could you see a grand bargain? I think the president is sincerely committed to not wanting to leave a structural deficit as one of his legacies. Is there the political room to do it? I don't know. I don't think we know yet. Let me turn now to the impact on 2016. All right. Govern or posture. The Republican primary process is clearly going to be, as we saw in 2012 and as we saw in 2008, is going to drive all of the candidates, likely to drive them all to the right. We all remember the Republican primary debate where the question was, I think, how many of you believe in evolution? And I think one raised his hand. If there were a budget deal which was $9 of tax reduction, $9 of spending reduction for $1 of tax increase, would any of you support that? And none of them raised their hands to support even a 90-10 deal to eliminate the federal deficit. So the dynamic there will be to push to the right, and I think they'll be looking to their friends in the Congress to help promote that conservative agenda. I'll come back in a second to who I think might emerge as the leading candidates on the right. Let me turn quickly to the left. The question everybody asks is Hillary going to run? I can tell you that her closest friends and aides don't know for a fact. Our partner and founder, Mac McClarty, has known Hillary Clinton since she was 25 years old, and he first met her as Bill Clinton's girlfriend and then wife back when they came back from Yale Law School. They still remain very close. She hasn't told him. I was earlier this week with one of Hillary Clinton's chief fundraisers from 2008, very close to Secretary Clinton. She doesn't know. Secretary Clinton is clearly playing a very careful game here, and yet you have to read the body language and see that it's highly likely that she is positioning herself to be able to run should she decide to. And the longer she waits, the more damaging it is to the Democratic prospects if she doesn't run. You know, because she has been out there for the last 2 years as the heir apparent, you have not seen a farm team of Democratic candidates emerge. Yes, you have a few names. You have a Martin O'Malley, maybe an Andrew Cuomo, maybe a Kirsten Gillibrand, who some people talk about. I happen to think very highly of her. Mark Warner has been talked about, although when you're sitting on a razor-thin lead, it's kind of hard to think of presidential ambitions. You're mainly just hoping to hold on to what you have right now. But it is not the kind of robust, well-organized, well-funded field that you'd like to see 2 years out from a presidential election because of Secretary Clinton's really commanding position. If she waits much longer and then doesn't run, it's going to be very damaging for Democratic hopes. But clearly her strategy would be to wait as long as possible because she knows what's coming. We all saw during her book tour of a couple of months ago how quickly the talking points were written against her, how quickly people jumped on any verbal flub or issue in what she'd written in her book or what she said. She is steeling herself for what she knows is going to be 2 years in which her opponents, political opponents, will be, quite appropriately, I'm not saying it's wrong, this is politics, are going to be looking to dirty her up and to weaken her before you get to 2016. So I don't fault her for waiting. But I think the Democrats do need to know who their leader is going to be and who their standard bearer will be. Will there be opposition in a Democratic primary process? Maybe. I don't think it'll be substantial opposition. I love my old boss, Joe Biden. I think if she did not run, he would clearly look in the mirror and say, why not me? Whether he would run if she is the candidate, I don't know. I guess I would tend to doubt it. But if she runs, she'll have minor party opposition from minor figures, maybe a Bernie Sanders from Vermont, who is, nominally a member of the Socialist Party, even though he caucuses with the Democrats. But she'll have essentially a coronation on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, I mentioned some of the leading candidates who have put themselves out so far. They clearly enthuse those on the right, but they leave kind of the mainstream business Republicans and the old line Republicans deeply concerned. And so there's great pressure on Jeb Bush to run. A lot of people have a lot of nostalgia for Bush the father for 41, some nostalgia for Bush 43, and there's a real sense that kind of with the three of them, maybe Jeb Bush was always the guy who had the greatest intellect, the greatest passion for policy, conservative credentials that he matched with pragmatic governing style. A very attractive combination for many. I don't know whether he will run. I've seen him recently. You know, you can tell when a politician is getting ready to run. They lose weight, they cut their hair, they get new glasses, they look pretty snappy, they're practicing snappy lines. And when I saw him, he was reading from note cards, you know, the glasses pushed down on the end of his nose, and I won't make any comment about his physique. So he did not give off the aura of somebody who is, you know, going, as Hillary is, getting ready for a tough race. Who else do I think might jump in? Well, I think surprised to see he, I think, appeared in 27 states during this midterm process. This past summer, he convened all of his fundraisers in Utah for a policy conference where they talked about issues. I don't think you get out there and go to 27 states and raise vast quantities of money and speak on behalf of innumerable candidates all over the country if you're not thinking that maybe it ain't over for you yet. So I'd say wait and see what Mitt Romney really does. Now, if I'm Hillary Clinton, who do I want to run against? I'd love to run against Jeb Bush or Mitt Romney. You know, you say, God, we want to have the second Clinton? Yeah, how about the third Bush? You know? Yeah, let's talk about Hillary care. Okay, let's talk about Romney care. Neither Bush nor Romney are fresh faces. Neither can project out much beyond the Republican base. Romney certainly failed to enthuse the new demographics that are coming up and really shaping the national electorates. I think if Hillary Clinton would look at those guys and say, I know what my playbook looks like against you guys. Against Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, or especially Rand Paul, less of a clear playbook. These guys, each of them, especially Rand Paul, you know, can appeal to people in a fresh way, a different way. There are people out there who might not have been engaged in the political process before, who are going to be excited by one of these guys in different ways, whether because they're Hispanic, or because they're evangelicals who have been gotten tired of politics and have become disillusioned, or frankly, young kids who like to smoke pot and look at a Rand Paul and say, you know, this is a guy who's conservative, but on social issues is going to say, tell people to get out of my life, and I kind of like that combination. And he's not going to send me off to any war that I don't like, so maybe I like this guy. So those are the ones who can frankly bring a fresh playbook that would be a new playbook against which a Democrat would have to figure out how to run. So Arthur, that's what happened this week. That's what we might see in the next. That's what we might see in the next 2 years. And Cunningham's predictions for 2016. Oh, let me actually give you my prediction for 2016. Okay. All right. It's going to be Romney, Rubio on the Republican side, and it's going to be Clinton, Castro. Julian Castro, the former mayor of San Antonio, very charismatic Hispanic from Texas, and is now the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development.
Okay, Nelson, thank you for that. I hope you come back next year so we can check.
We will have erased the tapes by then.
So, open to the floor. We only have about 16 minutes, or less, because it has to leave for his next meeting. So, make your question very succinct, please.
Yeah, and I'll try to be more succinct in my answers than I was in my outline.
I'd like to ask about apathy that you raised, but as a strategist, the polls were so wrong, and the get out the vote mechanism didn't work.
Yeah.
What was the thing that really you could comment on what we have to do next in the next election to get a better read and get the Democrats?
Yeah. Well, this is the second election in a row where the polls were off. In 2012, I saw a statistic this week they favored Republicans by 3 points better than the voters actually gave them. So the Democrats did better in 2012 than the polls predicted. This time it was a 4-point swing in the other direction. Democrats did 4 points worse than the polls predicted. There's a lot of technical reasons for that. You know, it used to be 67% of people would respond to polls when called. Now it's 22%. The effective yield used to be somewhere in the 30s. Now it's 9% of all people who are reached actually will answer all the questions that a pollster asked. It's become much, much harder to get people to answer questions on the phone. And, you know, you find that no matter how hard you work, you sometimes just can't overcome apathy and anomie, and that's clearly what happened in this race. Mark Warner in Virginia thought he knew his people, he thought he knew who would go to the polls, and they just failed to show up, and they had some of the lowest turnout that you've seen in a long time. And it wasn't so much that people were voting for Ed Gillespie, it's that the Mark Warner voters just didn't bother to get up and out. In a presidential year, in 2 years, again, I think there's much more excitement around a presidential race. You tend to have much higher turnout, and you're likely to have less of a polling problem than you had this time around.
Next.
Question. On lame duck.
You gave pretty well on energy issues, so I look forward to that question.
Thank you. You mentioned lame duck, some foreign policy issues. You mentioned ISIS. You mentioned Iran. You didn't mention Menendez-Squirker or any of the Russia initiatives out there. Do you think something's going to happen on Russia and the lame duck?
I've not heard anybody talking about it as one of the key agenda items. It really all depends on what appetite they have to really deal with each other when they get together next week. Are they just so mad at each other and so bleh, that they all just want to go home? If so, they're going to try to race through things as quickly as possible and get the heck out of Washington. It doesn't mean that they couldn't come back, particularly if, for example, there's progress on the Iranian negotiations that create concern on the conservative side, and they want to come back and address that later. And if so, a Corker Menendez might well come up. But the best I can tell you on Corker Menendez is that nobody is talking about it. Doesn't mean it won't happen, but it's not at the forefront of the issues that I've heard about to be taken up.
Okay, next question.
Yeah. Some people are speculating that TPP could go forward without including Japan. What do you think?
Well, I think it clearly could go forward without including Japan. I think that would be a tragedy. I think it would be much less meaningful than it would be if it included Japan. I think we have a historic opportunity to deal with some of these long-standing trade issues and to really cement that economic alliance that we've had for so long on the security side. It would be a tremendous move forward. I'd like it even better if Korea were at the table and negotiating too. They're not yet there, although I think the anticipation would be that if TPP moves forward, the next step, the Koreans will be joining, presumably after people have come to terms with it. So I think Japan will be in there, should be in there, I'm sorry. Japan should be in there. It would be a tragedy if they weren't. I do not blame the Japanese for wanting to really feel very comfortable that the president has trade promotion authority before, or has it at least in hand, before they, or in sight, I should say, before they put their best deal on the table. The U.S. negotiating record has been to negotiate deals and then come back and say, oh, by the way, we'd like to renegotiate. So they did that with Korea, they did that with Colombia, they did that with Peru, did that with Panama. I don't blame the Japanese at all for wanting to look for assurances from the U.S. government that the final deal will be the final deal. But I'm certainly hopeful that both sides understand that this is a window that could close. And once it closes, who knows when it might open.
Going back to the political issue concerning the Senkaku Islands, do you think now that the Republicans have the control, is there going to be a more aggressive stance against China?
You know, let me actually turn to Tom Hubbard on this. Because he has spent a whole career studying exactly these issues, and his answer is going to be better than mine.
frankly, no. I don't think there will be major changes. I think one of the remarkable things is how much national consensus there is, how much bipartisan consensus there is on how to deal with Asia, with the importance of Asia, the importance of our Asian allies, the importance of their concerns, whether it's the Senkakus or the islands in the South China Sea. But I think we hear more rhetoric. We may hear some harsher rhetoric from the Republicans, but I think in reality, our approach to China is bipartisan.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question about the nature of the structural impact of having a unified government on the next election, as opposed to emotional issues, personality issues. In a sense, if you don't posture, you can't govern. So
Yeah.
the real question is whether there will be government, and what impact does a unified congressional opposition to the White House have on the next election?
Yeah. Well, on the next election, I would say if maybe the only Democrat in Washington or in the U.S. who was not completely depressed by Tuesday's results might be Secretary Clinton, because I think she would like nothing better than to take a page out of Harry Truman's book and run against Congress. And if the Republicans are in charge of both houses now, she can run against Congress. And she or whoever the Democratic nominee is going to sit back and wait for bills to pop out of the Congress, wait for bills to advance, that on the Democratic side will allow them to draw sharp distinctions and draw issues and say, really? You want to give the car keys to those guys? Because look what they tried to do here. So I think both sides will have an interest in using sensitive or emotional issues or bills that might pop out of the Republican Congress to define issues on one side or the other.
Both parties have anti-trade wings in them, and just was wondering, after the elections, what your sense is in terms of especially the Republican Party or the people who actually won the elections. Is there going to be movement more away from the anti-trade Tea Partyites towards more moderate? And also on the Democrat side, do you think there was any shift in terms of the pro-trade versus anti-trade folks?
Yeah. On the Republican side, I think we all have to see how much more conservative this new Congress is than this new Republican caucus is in both houses than the one we've seen. It's clearly going to be more conservative. It's not going to be as Tea Party flavored as the freshman class that came in 4 years ago, but it's going to be more conservative. And will Boehner be allowed to make deals? Will McConnell be allowed to make deals? We don't know yet.
Well, but specifically on trade, though, what do you think? Because you can be conservative and still be pro-free trade.
Yes, you can, and yet look at issues like the Exim Bank, where conservatives are opposing the Exim Bank. I'd like to think that sort of free market Republicans would naturally support free trade. It ought to be that way. It doesn't always work out that way when it comes to things that a Democratic president wants, as I said before. On the Democratic side, I don't really think it has changed the direction of the party, these elections, in terms of their perception on trade. I think that requires presidential leadership, which we have not yet seen on the issue of trade. Bill Clinton understood that lesson. I hope Barack Obama steps forward and leads on trade in order to lead Democrats in the right direction on this issue.
Okay, according to my watch, we have time for one more question.
Yes, I think this is a very simple question, but maybe it's difficult. How do you recommend to the Abe administration to deal with the new Congress and Obama, rest of the Obama administration?
I think you're not going to see much of a change of direction coming out of the Congress in terms of congressional views about U.S.-Japan relations or the issues that are important to Japan or to economic interests. So I frankly think it's going to be status quo, and I would recommend a very straightforward position on the part of the Abe government, which they've had to date and which I would anticipate. Tom, do you have anything to add to that? Yeah.
Well, let me just say, I think, as a former diplomat, I always have various interests in mind, but I do believe one of the lessons that comes out of Nelson's talk today is that, if one is ever going to be flexible on TPP, on the issues, now is the time.
That's right. That's right. And I agree fully on that.
Very good. So, I'd like to present you with the Certificate of Appreciation from ACCJ.